Well, welcome back to our brown bag follow-up. I'm Jennifer Bleiker, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the details that we didn't get a touch on. Brown bag number 68, dealing with a public that is motivated by their hate for government. And in today's follow-on, the detail that we needed to discuss was you're going to have a need to get these anti-government groups, these PAIs, potentially affected interests, to conclude that what you're working on is reasonable and responsible, that you do care, but also to come to the conclusion that the facts are as they are, as you say they are, that the truth is as you see it, that the system works as it does, as well as to be aware of the misperceptions, the rumors that are out there, the conspiracy theories. And I have a case study that Hans and Anna Marie participated in when we were moving from Wyoming to California that I think will help get the message across to you. Now, the tendency is, while you have this need to bring the public up to speed and these anti-government groups and specifically up to speed on the relevant facts and information relative to your project, you're going to have a tendency to want to lecture them. And that's probably the worst thing you could do. Just as any of us, having been a teenager or having children of our own, I have a 3- and a 6-year-old, and they're not very receptive to lecture mode. Certainly anyone older than that is even less so. And it's imperative that you hear the subtlety in what I'm saying, which is get them to conclude, get them to discover the truth about your work, get them to appreciate how the system works. Get them to understand. It doesn't mean you told them and now you can check the block and move on. No, that's not good enough. Until these anti-government groups understand the facts, until they discover the truth, until they appreciate the nature of the system within which you are working on their own terms, you're going to have a hard time making any progress in getting them to not attack you for being one of these groups that they so vehemently hate. And one of the ironies is that this particularly applies to those potentially affected interests, those anti-government groups that feel they genuinely hate government, yet they're the first to turn to government for help when they get into serious trouble, whether it's a natural catastrophe or some economic fallout. They don't realize that, as Hans talked about in the brown bag, they use the deductions on their mortgage interest rate when they submit their taxes, or in the case I'm about to share with you, they refer to a document, the U.S. Constitution, as one worthy of having bloodshed should it be violated. So there are some hypocrisies in here, and you will need to help the public sift through them and realize we don't really mean what we're saying. We didn't understand the truth as it was. We didn't understand all the facts. Yes, we were under these misperceptions. We had fallen under some conspiracy theory thinking. Turns out what you're working on really is reasonable and responsible. So this case came out when we were moving from Wyoming to California, and Hans and Anna Marie were contacted by a wildlife agency that was being threatened with bloodshed. And the staff said, these people are serious. They really mean violence. And the legislature found out that we were holding some closed-door hearings, not we, but the wildlife agency, was doing some closed-door negotiations with some native tribes relative to their peace treaty on hunting and fishing regulations that would be applied to white people coming on the reservation. Now, when the legislature, some members of the legislature found out about these closed-door negotiations, all hell broke loose. The media jumped on attacks of them, the legislature, the public, and then these anti-government groups. And things turned ugly, and then there was this promise of violence. And the legislature's solution was that the agency was going to have to hold several public meetings all across the state. And the first one would be in 3 weeks from when they contacted Hans and Anna Marie. So that didn't leave a lot of time for us to help them make progress on getting the public informed on getting them to understand all the relevant facts and issues and the truth and the system and the agency's mandate. So, that being said, our hands were pretty much tied, and the only thing we could offer was, since they were going to have to hold these public hearings, the best thing to do would be to turn them into what we would call an open house. Now, if you have a copy of our handbook, you can look up the details of what constitutes an open house in our minds. Some of the general guidelines are that it has to span over several days. It's something that discourages grandstanding, so you're not going to hold it from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. and have a mob group show up and then people feel compelled to grandstand against you, and there's no lecturing by any staff from the agency. Instead, what we had them do was get several pieces of butcher paper, magic marker, and in handwriting, not computer, handwrite out all the facts, all the relevant facts to the project, all the relevant issues to the project, all the misperceptions relevant to the project, all the conspiracy theories relevant to the project, and really that's where the hard work came in. Even though the staff was very nervous about showing up at these public hearings because of the promise of bloodshed and because they were being attacked so vociferously in the media, they couldn't do anything to counteract what was being said. The anti-government groups were being featured on the main page of the newspaper day after day, and it was just snowballing into this mob hate of the agency. They didn't want to show up at these meetings, yet they were being forced to. And so we had them put all the work and all that preparation into before they showed up at the what we called an open house. And to do all their thinking then, show up, have all the, each page would feature one fact, one issue. And then there would be several pages that were blank, and except at the top where it said, what are we missing? And several pens beneath where people could submit, hey, you missed this fact, you missed this issue. You don't see it from my lens. What about this theory that's out there, or this rumor that I've heard? Is it true? And so they did a very good job of bringing the public up to speed without lecturing. They used the medium that they were being forced to by the legislature. And the phenomenal thing is, the result was it was incredibly successful. The leader of the anti-government group that had promised bloodshed went to the governor and in front of a journalist reversed himself publicly and said, I think these negotiations are very reasonable and should be continued. The only question is, how can we participate as the other part of the equation? So although they had said we are entirely anti-government, we are promising bloodshed, this agency is violating our constitutional rights. And again, there's that little caveat we want you to notice. There's some hypocrisy built into that because they were referring to the U.S. government's document, the U.S. Constitution, which is the foundation of our government, as being, if it's violated, we will commit violence. And they weren't self-aware enough to realize there's some hypocrisy built into what they were saying. But once they looked at all the issues, all the facts, and everything without being lectured, they were able to come to the conclusion that what the agency was promising, what the agency had been working on, was reasonable. They had been making important progress. Now, the agency really had no business probably doing this behind closed door without even the legislature being aware, let alone the public and these anti-government groups. And what we would recommend, always, make life easier for yourself. Start from the beginning. Get consent building as you go. It's much easier than waiting until the ship hits the sand. So you don't have to show up at this kind of setting, and we don't promise that an open house would work. It's not the technique that I'm trying to encourage you to take a close look at. It's looking at every opportunity you have to get your public, your anti-government potential PAI, your potentially affected interests, get these members of the public, these groups, to come to the conclusion that what you're working on is reasonable and responsible, and do so without lecturing. And you can make some real progress where even they, who had promised bloodshed and said that this agency, this wildlife agency, was being so irresponsible and was playing fast and loose with their constitutional right, the first meeting, they showed up, said to the governor, what they're working on is reasonable and responsible. I think it should be continued. And reversed himself for his members of his group to get the message when this journalist then published that he reversed himself, that it was reasonable and responsible and not worth pursuing, even though they had deemed themselves as an anti-government group, period. So that's a challenge to you. Look at every opportunity you have to get somebody to appreciate the facts and the truth as it is, to understand your mandate and what you're working on, how you're going about it is reasonable and responsible, and get them to conclude that. Again, don't check the box because you told them. So that's what we had to share with you today. We look forward to you joining us in next month's session on brown bag number 69. And until then, we wish you the best in all your consent building efforts.